I gave my son the house. I signed the papers on a Tuesday, and by Friday he'd already changed the locks. I keep coming back to that Tuesday. The way he sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the one I'd built myself back in '89, yellow pine, sanded smooth, and slid the folder across like he was doing me a favor. "It's just to protect your assets, Dad," he said. "Estate planning, everyone does it." He had a pen ready. I noticed that. He had a pen ready before I'd even asked what I was signing. "My name is Harold Bryce McIntosh. I'm 67 years old. I worked 31 years in industrial electrical for a contracting firm out of Sudbury, Ontario, and I retired with a pension modest enough that I knew better than to waste a dollar of it. I raised my son alone after his mother passed in 2009, leukemia. Fast and merciless, the kind that doesn't negotiate. I worked overtime that whole year so we could keep the house. A brick semi-detached on Lorne Street that my wife and I had bought when the neighborhood was still mostly working families and corner stores. By the time my son was grown, that neighborhood had changed. The house was worth something, more than something. That was the problem, I think. Or maybe it was never the house. Maybe it was always me, too trusting, too proud of who I thought he'd become. My son's name is Reeve. He's 34. He works in property management, or at least that's what he tells people at parties. What he actually does is flip distressed properties, which means he buys houses from people who are desperate and sells them to people who are greedy, and he calls this a career. He learned the business fast, I'll give him that. Quick with numbers, quick with charm. His mother's eyes. My stubbornness, twisted into something I didn't recognize. He'd been after me about the house for 2 years before that Tuesday. "You should transfer title while you're still sharp, Dad. The probate fees alone would eat up 20%. Don't you want to avoid the hassle?" I'd put him off every time. I wasn't ready. It wasn't just property to me. It was the kitchen table I'd built, and the backyard where Sandra and I had put in a vegetable garden that I still kept going every summer. Tomatoes, green onions, a row of dill that came back wild every year, no matter what I did to stop it. It was the window in the upstairs hall, where she used to stand with her morning coffee, watching the street wake up. But I was also 66, and my left knee was getting bad, and I'd had a minor cardiac event the previous January. The doctors called it a warning, which is a word that sounds manageable until you're lying in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning, wondering if this is it. That scared me more than I admitted to anyone. I started thinking about things I'd put off thinking about. So when Reeve drove up from Toronto that September weekend and sat me down and said he'd had a lawyer draft something up, I was more open to it than I'd ever been. He explained it clearly, or what I thought was clearly. He said the title would transfer to him, but I'd retain what he called a life interest, meaning I could live in the house for as long as I was alive. He said it was standard. He said it was what responsible families did. He had the folder. He had the pen. I signed. 3 pages. I didn't read every line because he was explaining it as I went, and I trusted him. He is my son. He is the child I drove to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 9 winters. The child I sat beside in emergency rooms twice. The child I held when his mother died and I promised him, that we'd be all right. He left on Sunday with the folder. I found out what I'd actually signed 11 days later, when I got a letter from his lawyer, not my lawyer, his, informing me that as the registered owner of the property at 44 Lorne Street, my son intended to list it for sale, and would I please be in contact regarding my transition timeline. Transition timeline. I had to read it 3 times before I understood what I was reading. I called Reeve. He didn't answer. I called again. He picked up on the 4th try, and his voice had changed. Not the voice he used with me on Sunday, warm and patient and explaining things slowly. This was a different voice, flat, a little bored. He said I had misunderstood the nature of the transfer. He said there was no life interest clause. He said I could stay until the house sold, which he expected to be within 60 days given the market, and that he'd already spoken to a real estate agent. He said he had arranged something appropriate for me, a retirement residence in New Sudbury. Very nice, good amenities. He'd toured it himself. He said I should start thinking about what I wanted to move. "What I want to move," I said. "Dad, this is the right thing. You've been alone too long up there. You need." I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table. My kitchen table for a long time after that. The dill in the backyard had gone to seed weeks ago, dry and feathery, the way it gets in October. I could see it through the window over the sink. Sandra had loved dill. She put it in everything. I am not the kind of man who cries easily. I learned that from my father, which I'm not sure was a lesson worth learning. But I sat at that table, and I looked at that garden, and something in my chest collapsed the way an old structure does. Not all at once, slowly, room by room. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning I called a lawyer, not someone Reeve had mentioned. I went through the phone book, the actual phone book, the one I still kept in the drawer under the phone, and I found a name, a firm on Elm Street, and I called and made an appointment for the following Thursday. Her name was Constance Oduya. She was maybe 45. With reading glasses, she kept sliding down her nose and pushing back up, and she had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she was measuring something and not telling you what the measurement was. I brought every document I could find. She read them carefully, slowly, while I sat in the chair across from her desk and tried not to fidget. She took off her glasses. She set them on the papers. She looked at me. "Mr. McIntosh," she said, "what you signed is not what your son told you it was. There was no life interest clause. There was no protection of my right to remain in the property. What I had signed was a straightforward title transfer, prepared by Reeves' lawyer, witnessed by Reeves' colleague, notarized and filed, legal on its face. And the property at 44 Lawrence Street was now, in every meaningful sense, my son's to sell. "Is there anything?" I started. "There may be," she said. "I want to be careful about what I tell you right now because I want to be accurate." She picked up her glasses again. "If we can establish that you were misled about the nature of what you were signing, if there's evidence of misrepresentation, there's a basis for a civil claim. The transfer could potentially be voided. But I want to be honest with you. It's not simple, and it's not fast, and it will depend very much on what we can document." "What do I need to document?" "Everything," she said, "every conversation, every text, every email. Everything he said to you about what you were signing, and every way it differs from what you actually signed. Start writing it down tonight while it's fresh. Write down everything you remember." I drove home and I wrote for 4 hours. I filled a legal pad. I found the text messages on my phone, 17 of them from Reeve over the preceding 2 years, and 4 from that September weekend, including one where he'd written, and I read this back 3 times to make sure I had it right. "The life interest clause means you stay as long as you want, Dad. It's built right into the document. Don't worry." I photographed that text on my phone and emailed it to Constance the same evening. My hands were steady when I did it. I surprised myself. She called me the next morning. "Mr. McIntosh," she said, and I could hear something shift in her voice. Not excitement exactly, but the measured satisfaction of someone who has found what they needed. "I think we have something to work with." The next several months were not easy to live through, and I'm not sure I have the words to describe them accurately without making it sound more dramatic than it felt at the time. Because it didn't feel dramatic. It felt like waiting. Every week there were forms and calls and waiting, and I kept going to work in the garden until the frost came, and then I sat by the window and watched the street, and I did not know if I was still living in my own home or in someone else's property or somewhere in between. Reeve listed the house in November. A sign went up on my lawn, with his agent's name and a 1-800 number. I left it there. Constance said to leave it there. She had filed for an injunction to halt the sale pending the civil claim. It was granted in early December, which meant the listing had to be pulled. Reeve called me when that happened. He didn't use his flat voice this time. He used a voice I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, sharp and indignant, the voice of someone who believed that the rules had been made against him specifically. He said I was being irrational. He said I was going to spend everything I had on legal fees fighting him. He said he would countersue. He said, and I wrote this down too after I hung up, that I should think about what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up. January was cold. I turned 67 in January, which I have never made a fuss about, and didn't start then. My neighbor Arlene, she's been next door for 22 years. We wave across the fence in summer and shovel each other's walks in winter. That sort of relationship. She knocked on my door that evening with a container of her mushroom barley soup and a butter tart from the bakery downtown. She didn't know the specifics of what was happening. I hadn't told many people. But she knew something was wrong because she's the kind of person who notices. "You've been quiet," she said, standing in my doorway. "I'm always quiet," I said. "Quieter," she said. I let her in. I told her some of it. She sat at my kitchen table and listened and didn't say much, which was the right thing to do. She said, "Do you need anything?" I said I didn't think so. She said, "Ask if you do," and left the soup. I ate the soup. It was very good. I thought about Sandra. I thought about the fact that Arlene had been shoveling my walk some mornings before I was up, not saying anything about it, just doing it, for years. I thought about the kind of person who does that. The court date was set for late March. Civil proceedings in Ontario are not quick and they are not cheap, and I want to be honest about that. Constance's fees were substantial, and I spent more than a few nights calculating whether I could see this through. My pension covered my monthly expenses, but not much beyond. I had some savings, not a lot, but enough, and I made the decision to use them. I decided that before I went to sleep one night in February, and I didn't revisit it. Some decisions, once made, stay made. Constance was thorough. I came to understand in those months that thoroughness is what a good lawyer actually is. Not dramatic speeches or clever arguments, just methodical, relentless attention to what can be proved. She gathered the texts. She had a handwriting analyst confirm the signature was obtained without my reading the full document. Possible to demonstrate, she said, based on the speed and pressure of the signature relative to the document's complexity. She found 2 of Reeves' previous real estate transactions that had involved what the courts had described as aggressive use of information asymmetry. Not criminal convictions, but documented complaints, a paper trail. She put together a picture. On the morning of the court date, I wore the sport coat I'd worn to Sandra's funeral because it was the only good jacket I owned and it still fit. I drove myself. I didn't ask anyone to come. I parked on the street and walked to the courthouse and found the right room and sat down and waited. Reeve was already there with his lawyer, a tall man in his 40s who had the practiced ease of someone who spent a lot of time in courtrooms. Reeve didn't look at me when I came in. He looked at his phone, and then at his lawyer, and then at the wall. I don't know what I expected to feel, seeing him. What I actually felt was tired. Not angry. I'd been angry in October and November and December, in waves that came and went and left me hollow. By March, the anger had burned down to something quieter, something that was mainly just grief still. The proceeding was not what television teaches you to expect. There were no speeches. There were submissions of evidence. There were Constance's arguments, careful and precise. And there were the other lawyer's arguments, less precise than he wanted them to be, because Constance's documentation was very good. The judge was a woman who listened without expression and made notes and asked 2 questions, both of them about the text message. That text message. The life interest clause means you stay as long as you want, Dad. It's built right into the document. Don't worry. The judge recessed for 90 minutes. I went to the hallway and sat on a bench and drank coffee from a paper cup and looked at the floor. Constance came out and sat beside me but didn't say anything, which I appreciated. When we went back in, the judge ruled that the transfer of title had been obtained through material misrepresentation and was therefore void. The property at 44 Lorne Street was to be returned to my name. Reeve was ordered to pay costs, which Constance later told me would cover roughly half her fees. He was also referred for a review by the Law Society, given the prior complaints, not because he was a lawyer himself, but because his transaction patterns conduct warranting scrutiny by the real estate regulatory body. I signed more papers that afternoon. Different papers. Papers that meant the house was mine again. I don't know exactly what I felt driving home. The radio was on, CBC, the afternoon program, and there was someone talking about something in Ottawa, some committee, and I turned it off because I didn't want noise. I wanted to hear the road and my own breathing and not much else. I turned onto Lorne Street and I saw my house, brick, unremarkable, the garden bare and waiting for spring, and I sat in the driveway for a while before I went in. Inside I made tea. I stood at the window over the sink and looked at the backyard. In a few months I'd put in the tomatoes again. The dill would come up on its own, the way it always did. I didn't hear from Reeve after that. His lawyer sent a brief letter in April acknowledging the ruling. Nothing from Reeve directly. Not an apology, not an explanation. I had stopped expecting one by then, which is not the same as not wanting one. I want to be accurate about that. What I got instead in that strange quiet spring was something I hadn't anticipated. Arlene started knocking on my door more often, not checking on me exactly, but dropping things off. A cutting from a plant, she said, would do well in my conditions. A newspaper clipping about a walking group that met Tuesdays at the conservation area outside town. You should go, she said. I'll go with you the first time if you want. I went. I went because I was 67 and alone, and I had spent the previous 7 months, learning what it felt like to have the floor pulled out from under you, and I thought maybe it was time to stop standing in one spot, waiting for stability, and start looking for it somewhere else. The walking group was mostly people around my age. There was a retired school teacher named Gerald who'd moved up from Timmins, a woman named Brenda who'd done 30 years with the federal government, and now volunteered with a literacy program, a man named Chip, his real name, he said, not a nickname, who'd worked in forestry and could name every tree we passed, which became the kind of ongoing amusement that a group needs to hold together. I started going every Tuesday. I want to say something true here, because I think it matters. I am not a person who makes friends easily. I never have been. I spent most of my adult life working and building things and being content with a narrow life, because it was a full narrow life, and I had Sandra in it, and when I lost her, I substituted routine for the fullness, which is a particular kind of coping strategy that works until it doesn't. What I found in that walking group, what I found in Arlene bringing soup, in Constance Oduya, pushing her glasses back up her nose and fighting for something she could have declined to take on, was that the world had more people in it than I'd made room for, that I had done myself a particular kind of harm by deciding somewhere along the way that the only person I needed to hold close was my son. I know Reeve is still in Toronto. I know because a former colleague of mine mentioned running into him at a trade show last fall, and told me this without knowing what had happened between us, and I said only, and changed the subject. I don't know if he ever thinks about what he did. I don't know if he regretted it in the courtroom, or if he just recalculated and moved on. People like Reeve, and I say this as his father, having loved him more completely than he ever understood, are often very good at recalculating and moving on. I can't make him regret it. I couldn't make him honest when he was young, and I couldn't make him kind when I tried hardest to model what that looked like, and I can't make him regret what he did now. That's simply the truth of it. What I can do is put in the tomatoes. What I can do is show up Tuesday morning and walk with people who don't know the worst year of my life, and don't need to know it, and who make bad jokes about tree identification and buy each other coffee after. What I can do is leave my door unlocked on Sunday afternoons, the way Arlene has started stopping by with one excuse or another. A borrowed book returned, a question about a hardware store, and I put the kettle on before she's finished knocking, because we both know why she's actually there. And that's all right. That is more than all right. The dill came up again in May. It always does. I don't know what kind of father I was in the full accounting of it. I tried. I know that I tried. But trying and succeeding are different things. And I think somewhere in the years after Sandra died, Reeve and I started speaking entirely different languages, and I told myself the gap was smaller than it was because I needed that to be true. I needed it so badly that I signed the papers and believed him and lost, for a time the only piece of her I had left. But I have it back now. The house on Lorne Street, the yellow pine table, the garden, the dill coming up wild whether I plant it or not. I have Constance, who sends a brief card every Christmas, which I wasn't expecting and find that I look forward to. I have Arlene, who has never once said I told you so, though something was wrong before I admitted it. I have Tuesday mornings, which I now guard the way I used to guard nothing. I have learned, late, the hard way, the only way some lessons come, that family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up when you need them to, and stay when they don't have to, and shovel your walk without being asked. It's the people who sit at your table and listen. It is never too late to find those people. I know that now. It took me 67 years in a courtroom and a very good lawyer and a container of mushroom barley soup, but I know it.